I'm talking to Elayne Archer, who is the author of Crossing Troubled Waters, Memoirs of an English War Widow. It's quite a saga. Would you like to describe your book, or how would you describe it? Obviously,
Well,
memoirs.
it's basic. It's a memoir. My mother wrote 100 and when she died, my brother and I inherited 140 typewritten pages, which equals 200 pages,
Wow.
describing my mother's life. With a lot of, one of the reasons I really thought I had to do something with it, it took me many years, is because it's a wonderful interplay of history and personal history. I mean, my mother describes not only the war and the Blitz and how that, my father's death and how that changed our lives totally, but it also her description of it being a working woman in 1930s London, and then as a working mother in Toronto, where she faced almost hostility. Women didn't work, mothers did not work in those days. And there was no childcare. So I just thought it was an interesting description of what women have gone through. And only recently has it improved a bit, trying to deal with working and having children, whatever. When I first did it, I only did what my mother wrote, and I wrote, a few explanations for English terms. And then when my brother died, I inherited several boxes of further materials, letters from the RAF, my mother's other letters, more journal entries and postcards and photographs. And I thought this would be a much better memoir if I included all of those. And then I realized I sort of had to include my experience. I wrote it originally for my children. They were my audience. My children, just my son and my daughter, and who knew much less about their English family than they did about their father's family, my husband and my ex-husband's family, because they lived much closer to them. And I thought, this is the story of their English family, and my mother was really an amazing woman. There was the time when I realized I had to expand it. I had a draft of it in 2015. And then I discovered all those papers I told you about, and that took me another 3 years, partially because with all of that, I found a whole package of, my mother didn't throw out anything. Every letter I'd ever written my mother from Radcliffe.
Wow.
89 letters written on yellow, what I call foolscap, yellow legal pads, right, back and front. And I took what I thought would be 2 months. It turned out to be 6 months, reading all the letters at least twice, summarizing them. First, I asked the Radcliffe, the Schlesinger, if they'd like them. And of course they'd like them because they don't get letters anymore, right? Nobody writes letters. And then I wrote a 20-page essay on those times, both what I was going through and, what was happening in the world, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the blackout of 1965, the call up to Vietnam. And that took me about 6 months. So I took that time off, and then I got back. Those were the roadblocks. I didn't have writer's block so much as I had to just keep at it, which is what I did. I had my mother's example. And then I suppose one of my favorite passages, although I'd read it just once before, was my father's letters from Malta, in which he wrote one, say, on the 22nd of April, a few weeks before he died, congratulating my mother on having given birth to me on his very birthday. So I didn't know actually until I saw that letter that he knew I'd ever been born. So that was nice to know. I lived in Toronto until I came to Radcliffe, and I lived in Toronto for 18 years, although I'm not a Canadian citizen. I never had to become a citizen. I was a landed immigrant from what was then the British Empire, I guess. And the reason I applied to Radcliffe was that my brother was going back to drama school in London, and my mother was saying she was going to go back to London too. I didn't want to be the only one left in Toronto, so I applied to Radcliffe. And amazingly enough, what I found out, this is another story, but I found out on the day, 2 days before graduation, I met the lovely woman at a cocktail party who had interviewed me, and she said, Oh, I remember you. The committee was so impressed that you came all the way from the north. I think she figured Toronto was in the North Pole. And in the midst of winter, we admitted you immediately. We were so eager to fill our foreign student quota. So, I've always been a defender of quotas because I got into Radcliffe on a quota. But, Radcliffe did change my life because if I hadn't gone, I probably would have gone to the University of Toronto and still be living in Canada.
Yeah.
At one point, my mother announced that there would be some money coming. It was a week before Christmas, 2 weeks, from the Institute of Journalists. My father had been a member of that, and they would send us money occasionally. And I really did have visions of a wonderful roast beef and plum pudding dinner. And then my mother announced, I still remember, as I wrote this, I thought a lot about memory. How do you remember things? Do you add to it? I remember this when she announced that she'd use the money to buy tickets to see Tamburlaine the Great at the Royal Alexandra Theatre. And I remember thinking and saying to my brother, Tamburlaine the Great, I mean, Hamlet, come on, Macbeth. Anyway, I remember going into the theater, and it was one of those, it was all of gold and cherubs and chandeliers and red velvet seats, but we went up to the very top. But I did think, wow, the theater. We were in the last row, almost perpendicular to the stage. And when the chariot comes on with Tamburlaine, I thought, wow, the theater is really different. I looked at my mother, there was a tear coming down her face. And I look back now, I realize she was probably thinking of my father when they went to the theater in London. At the very end, and this is what I really remember, and I did not make this up or elaborate it. My mother stood up and shouted, and I clapped and shouted, bravo, bravo. But nobody in Toronto ever said such a thing. That was unheard of. They all looked at her, but the main actor, a man called Anthony Quayle, who later became knighted, it was apparently a very famous production of Tamburlaine. He stepped forward, he bowed to her and took off his crown. My mother was so happy, and I just think it was proof of, forget a roast beef dinner. We're going to the theater. And it was an important lesson for me that, reading books and going to plays going to museums. I remember the letters I wrote my mother from Radcliffe are full of all the museums I went to and all the plays I'd seen. And she really must have thought my daughter is becoming an educated, truly educated person. And that is what Harvard did for me. Yes, I think.
Talking here today with David Andelman, who was a longtime columnist for CNN and veteran correspondent for the New York Times, CBS News, etc. And in this book, The Red Line combines history and global politics to help us better understand the exploding number of military, political, and diplomatic crises around the globe. David, it's good to see you. And I wanted to ask you what inspired you to not only this book, but your career.
Well, my career really began at Harvard. I entered as a sophomore, thinking that I was going to become one of the great nuclear physicists of our time, and I was quickly disabused of that fact by my first year, sophomore actually, a physics lab instructor who said that I should never set foot in a physics lab again. So I had to find something else to do with my life. As it happened, there was a recruiting poster for WHRB. And I walked in there and it changed my life. I never looked back after that. So I changed to history, really sort of diplomatic history. I'd always been interested in international affairs. I came under the wing of Ernie May, Professor Ernest May, who was just an extraordinary figure and has really inspired my whole career. I nearly became a historian as a result of my early dealings with him, but decided I would rather be writing about the world today, and rather than writing about the world that someone else had been chronicling, a century ago. So I became a journalist instead, but with a sentiment of history and understanding that history really is the prism through which I think the best journalism can be seen. And that's how this book really came about. This one and several of my others is my fifth book, actually. But I've always, traveling around the world, I've really always looked at the events that I've been covering with the sense of what led up to this and what motivated it and what were they grounded in. And, very often it was history, and it was very often, again, increasingly it was red lines, and, they go very far back. So when it finally came time to do something important towards the end of my career, I like to think it's not necessarily maybe perhaps the end, but later in my career, red lines seem to be a very important moment to chronicle.
Were there any roadblocks that you felt in starting your career?
No, actually, I kind of wish I'd stayed another year at Harvard. I did Harvard in 3 years, which I many years later regretted. I wish I'd stayed on for a fourth year. But I was anxious to get out and set the world on fire. I'd been accepted at Columbia Journalism School and jumped immediately into journalism. And I guess hurdles, I've been very fortunate. I've always somehow been in the right place at the right time. I happened to be talking with Roy Silver, who was the New York Times correspondent in Mineola, Long Island correspondent. And I said, I really want to get overseas. And he said, well, my next door neighbor is the deputy foreign editor of the Times. Oh. He mentioned my name to Jerry Gold. He said, Seymour Topping, the then foreign editor, later managing editor of the Times, happens to be looking for a young intern, a news assistant. So, and he would have, had this been a week later, Top would have chosen someone else. If it had been a week earlier, he probably wouldn't have been thinking about it. But that's how I got to the Times for 12 amazing years. And, all over the world, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, Albany, all sorts of exciting places.
Yes. You mentioned many red lines. Again, going back to the publication of your first book, to publication of the red lines now. What would you say would be the 5 either most important, significant, or gravest red lines that we faced in between 73 and 21?
Well, probably most of the ones that are now in existence today are the most fraught and most dangerous, I would suggest. There were always, there was the Korean War, produced the red line between North and South Korea, which I deal with in the book at some length. The red lines involving that came down eventually between the communist Eastern Europe and Western Europe and the United States and NATO. That was a very important one. There's no doubt about that. I guess if I were going to choose 5, it would be the five of the ones that I highlighted in the book, particularly the South China Sea and the network of red lines that China has been, building around that. And that really did begin in a way as early as the 1970s when Mao was around. There was that certainly. There were the red lines in the Middle East, all kinds of red lines there. Many of these dated, in fact, back to, which I treated, by the way, in my next to last book, Shattered Peace, date back to the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I. And these were the lines that the peacemakers then drew. They really had very little idea what they'd never been to most of these areas. They'd never visited them. They never understood the people and their religions and their desires, their hopes for the future, their dreams for the future. So they established these red lines that were all but impossible to defend, and those continue now, and they are the most unstable in many respects in the world still today. Africa was just became a very big deal in the last couple of decades, and there are a number of red lines across Africa. But again, those you can trace back certainly to what was called the Scramble back in the around 1890s when Europe first discovered Africa and began dividing up the continent among the colonial powers. So there are all sorts of interesting red lines that have, if you trace them back, you realize what their origins were. In many respects, how poorly, how ignorantly they were established, and yet how toxic, therefore, they are today. And that's really, if there was a message from the book, That's the message. If you're going to draw a red line, make sure it works, it's effective, and it's stable. The first part of the acknowledgement, which is how the book begins, is one of my favorite passages. The genesis of this book goes back really to my earliest days traveling the world as a foreign correspondent, first for the New York Times, then for CBS News. But I owe an even earlier debt of my study to my studies at Harvard under Ernest R. May, the great diplomatic historian, and Henry Kissinger, then the brilliant professor of government and international affairs. Throughout my career, they succeeded in opening my eyes to the reality that today's seismic shifts in red lines and boundaries, geographic, political, or social, enforced by diplomacy, arms, or simply states of mind, may be traced to innumerable events I've chronicled personally over the past half century. When I began my research and compilation of red lines for this project, it began to dawn on me that the numbers, not to mention their reach and impact, were staggering. Effectively, there are more red lines in all their manifold forms and iterations in existence today than at any other single moment in history.
Talking to another of our class of 1966 Harvard-Radcliffe authors, Ellen Leopold, whose book, Under the Radar, Cancer and the Cold War, shows how nearly every aspect of our understanding and discussion of cancer bears the imprint of the Cold War entanglement. In the book, you document the military, governmental, industrial, and medical views of radiation and atomic energy. This is, do you chronicle this really from the end of World War II? What was the inspiration to write this book?
Well, it follows on from an earlier book that I wrote, which was about basically the cultural, social history of breast cancer in the 20th century. And I tripped over a woman when I was doing research for that book, who had been one of the first people to receive radiation as a treatment for cancer in the early 1950s. And her life had been completely turned upside down and basically ruined by it, because when cobalt radiation was introduced, it was not following a series of clinical trials in which they tried to assess its effectiveness and its dangers. The clinical trials were basically the first generation of people who underwent the therapy. So they were guinea pigs for radiotherapy that was very little was really known about. And in the case of this woman, whom I just met briefly 10 or 15 years ago, she was just an ordinary housewife in Wichita, Kansas, when she underwent this treatment. And her body was basically wrecked. But instead of just disappearing, sliding away into obscurity, she decided that she was going to sue the doctors for their failure to have warned her or given her any notion of the risks that might be involved in the therapy that they recommended for her. So she took them to court, which was a completely extraordinary thing for her to have done in the mid-50s. And the court case became one of the key steps forward in the whole business about giving informed consent to treatment. Because initially she lost the first round of the case, but she won on appeal. And it was clear that she had never been warned, given any warning about what kind of damage could be done by this treatment. So anyhow, I didn't write about her in the first book, but I thought that I would return to her at some time in the future. And when I did, I realized that her story about this novel treatment that she received was really a much broader one about the way the country, the way the government, and in particular the Atomic Energy Commission, used the introduction of radiotherapy as in the medical field as a way of softening the introduction of atomic weapons, radiation fallout in the military sector. So these two things were developed in tandem, Atoms for Peace atoms for war, and they both had an impact on each other. So that was how I got to this larger story through this woman, Irma Nathanson, in the 1950s. So this was the government sponsoring in the way that the government still does today, where they will invest in big pharma, but then fail to, for the most part, to hold on to the property rights that they have underwritten, because they want to encourage profitability in the drug market. So they will invest to get the thing going and make it feasible for companies to produce some advanced drugs. And then but they don't want to have government involvement in the way any of those products are marketed or monitored. So radiation was exactly the same. All of the isotopes that became the basis for radiotherapies were actually given to companies that expressed an interest in developing radiotherapies, and just given to them. And then when they developed the exact therapies that could be delivered to patients, the government backed off, didn't want to have any further involvement in the delivery of the system. And backing off meant that physicians were going to be in a position to decide for themselves, without any kind of oversight from the government, on how these therapies were going to be delivered, how much radiation was going to be involved in these therapies. There's nothing like the FDA for radiation therapies, or for physicians, or for surgery. The government does not control or vet any therapies or anything that surgeons wish to do. The government does not control. They have lots of ways of advising and giving recommendations, but they ultimately don't have the kind of power that the FDA does to curtail or monitor or rein in things which may be proved to be toxic.
Was any certain book or certain author a particular inspiration for you to follow this path?
Absolutely. I would say that Rachel Carson's Silent Spring is the key document for most people working in this arena, that the notion that we could quite easily destroy ourselves by our failure to actually look at the implications of the science that we've unleashed on the American population. So-called science. Yeah, definitely. Her courage, she was phenomenally courageous, because I don't know if you know, but she died of breast cancer. And I, in my earlier book on breast cancer, I included the correspondence between her and her surgeon, a guy called Barney Kreil, while she was undergoing treatment. And she was very clear that she did not want to let the world know that she was sick, because she thought that then her criticism of chemicals and of the damage we were doing in the environment would be judged sour grapes, because they had made her ill herself. So she didn't want to compromise the integrity of her science by bringing her own story into the picture. She's quite an extraordinary person. The book is really a history, but at the end, I make a plea for the idea that we might have something called a radiation audit, which is to say that because no one controls our consumption of radiation through our lifetime, it might now be a good idea, and because it is a known carcinogen, radiation, it might be a good idea for us to think about the cumulative effect of our exposures to radiation, in addition to what is in the atmosphere that we can't avoid. So I wrote a kind of plea at the end to think about doing this.